By now, just about everyone's heard of Angine de Poitrine. My name's Scott Lucier, and welcome to the very first episode of Inside the Music, where we do an in-depth analysis of what makes a song tick. This band had been popping up in my feed for weeks, but I kept ignoring them. My initial reaction was basically, two people in polka dot outfits and paper mache masks are probably not going to be for me. But then something interesting happened. Just about everyone started talking about them, and not casually, more like, you have to check out this band. Now, everyone's talking about how strange this band looks, and to be fair, the presentation is a big part of it. People also are talking about the microtonality and the odd time signatures, the custom double neck guitar / bass instrument, the looping setup, and all of that is important to the music, but almost nobody's really breaking down what's going on, musically I mean. I did see one video that touched on it, but it really only scratched the surface. There are other videos that go deep in the looping setup and the gear, which is cool, but it's not really what I'm interested in. I want to understand what's actually making this music work, because when you step back, what makes this special is that Angine are taking all of these elements that typically don't click with a wide audience, and they're making it work together in a really cool and interesting way. They somehow make microtonal melodies that are built on notes that don't even exist, catchy and memorable. They're able to play an odd time and even layer multiple time signatures and still make it groove. They get it to all come together in a way that just seems to click with a wide audience. And clearly I'm not the only one hearing that, because this thing's gone viral and it's connecting with an audience all over the world. So in this video, we're going to take a deep dive into their song Fabienk. I'm specifically using the live performance from the KEXP session, because for me, that's where this really clicked. There's something about the energy of that performance that just hits differently than the studio recording. And instead of just saying, this isn't a weird time signature, and it's microtonal, we're going to figure out exactly why it works. We're going to break it down section by section, phrase by phrase, layer by layer, and follow how the entire piece is being built in real time through this live looping performance. But before we get into the section by section breakdown, let's zoom out for a second and look at what's actually happening at a big picture level. What we're looking at here is basically a live looping performance. The guitar / bass player starts by recording a part into a looper pedal, and then plays it back repeatedly as a loop. If you're not familiar, a looper pedal is basically a recording device that lets you capture a piece of audio and then play it back continuously in a cycle. From there, you can layer on top of it, record a second part that loops in sync with the first, then a third, and so on. And it's all controlled in real time with foot switches. So you can start and stop recording, bring layers in and out, mute and unmute parts, all while continuing to play. So what you're hearing isn't just one performance, it's multiple parts being built and controlled live in the moment. And the first loop essentially becomes the foundation for everything that follows. From there, they begin layering additional parts one at a time, building everything up piece by piece. As the song progresses, they're not just adding layers, they're also muting and unmuting parts, bringing things in and out, and essentially shaping the arrangement in real time. At the same time, the drummer is doing something equally important. They're not just keeping time, they're actively developing the groove, shifting patterns, creating tension and release, and adapting to each new layer as it comes in. So what you end up with is this really cool interaction between the two players. One building the harmonic and melodic layers through looping, and the other shaping the rhythmic feel moment by moment. And that interaction is really the foundation of everything we're about to break down. Now, before we get into that first section, there's one important thing to keep in mind. It's actually pretty difficult to analyze what's going on melodically and harmonically here. Because of the microtonal nature of that double neck guitar / bass, they're able to use notes that literally don't even exist in traditional music. Notice how many frets there are on each of the guitar and bass necks. It's far more than the 12 per octave that we're used to. So we're not dealing with clean, standard pitch relationships the way we normally would. There certainly isn't anything resembling traditional harmony in this song at all. And what's really interesting is that despite how complex it sounds, the whole piece is actually built from a pretty small amount of material. There are only a handful of core ideas here. The probably looking at maybe 6 to 8 distinct parts on that guitar/bass instrument. Those parts get reused, layered, and reshaped throughout the performance. So instead of forcing a traditional harmonic analysis onto this, we're going to track the ideas themselves and how they're introduced, layered, and developed. Let's get into that first section. We'll call it Section A since it's the first section to appear. First off, the entire section is in 7, and that meter actually stays consistent through the entire piece. The tempo is roughly 128 beats per minute. Let's just listen to the whole thing once through for context. Now the section itself is 8 bars long, and it opens with a solo microtonal guitar melody. And right away, there are a couple things working against the listener here. Because it's microtonal, it's already hard to latch onto the pitch. And on top of that, there's some kind of effect on the guitar. It sounds like a ring modulator to me, and that makes the pitch feel even more unstable. So harmonically, you're a little ungrounded right from the start, but rhythmically, there's something just as important happening. The melody actually starts with a quarter note pickup before the first downbeat. So when you first hear it, it's not obvious where beat 1 is. I had to listen to it a few times before I could even figure out where the downbeat actually lands. The key insight is this: the downbeat is actually the second note that we hear. So what I'm going to do is play this again, starting from the downbeat, and I'll clap along so you can feel where beat 1 is every time it loops. Now, let's look at the actual rhythmic structure. The part itself is a repeated 2-bar phrase, and it's built on a 16th note subpulse. Bar 1 breaks down like this. I'll clap it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then bar 2 is almost identical, but it ends differently with this faster 7/16 alternate ending. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, tuck-a-dee-me, tuck-a-ta, tuck-a-dee-me, tuck-a-ta, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, tuck-a-dee-me, tuck-a-ta, tuck-a-dee-me, tuck-a-ta, 1. So you've got this repeating idea with just enough variation at the end to keep everything moving forward. Now, here's where the structure starts to reveal itself. The guitarist plays that full 2-bar pattern one time through, then captures it in the looper. Then we hear it loop 3 more times while they get ready for the next layer. So in total, we hear that phrase 4 times. And this is really important because despite how strange everything sounds, this is still built on something very familiar, groups of 4. The 2-bar phrase repeated 4 times. This is the exact same structural logic you hear in almost every style of music, from rock to hip-hop to jazz to country to classical. It's literally everywhere. So even though the surface feels chaotic, the underlying structure is actually very grounded. Now let's talk about the drums. For most of the section, the drummer is basically laying out. But right at the midpoint, on the first beat of bar 5, the drummer marks the downbeat with a light stroke on the ride cymbal. And then right at the end of the section, on the last time through the loop, the live bass and drums come in and they lock into that 7/16 ending figure in unison with the guitar. And that moment is really the transition into the next section. Now, let's give the B section a listen. This section's also 8 bars long, and structurally it's building directly on what we just heard. The original guitar loop is still going, repeating underneath everything exactly as before. But now, the rhythm section comes in. The drums and bass both enter, and they're locking in tight unison with the rhythm guitar. Now the bass is doing something interesting here. It's actually adding a variation every other time through the loop. At the end of bar 4, we hear a higher note that wasn't there in the first pass. So again, even within the repetition, there's just a little bit of development that keeps things moving. The bassist plays that 4-bar phrase live once, then captures it in the looper. So now we've got another repeating layer added to the texture. And then at bar 5, they switch back to the guitar and yet another layer is added. But this time it's more selective. They're not filling the space in the same way as the original part. They're just hitting certain notes, almost like accents. This new guitar layer subtly thickens the texture, livens up the sound, and adds a cool little pitchy bend that sort of reminds me of John Scofield a bit. Section C is a little shorter. It's just 4 bars long, but it plays a very important role. The guitarist adds a 1-bar loop that's based on that 7/16 variation we heard at the end of the previous sections. So instead of it just being an ending figure, it now becomes the main idea. And that 1-bar phrase repeats 4 times. Now here's where things get interesting. On the final repetition, right at the end of the phrase, the guitar layers are muted on the looper. So suddenly everything drops out except for the live bass and drums, which hit a unison fill using that same rhythmic pattern. So rhythmically, everything stays connected, but sonically there's a huge shift. And that dropout in the guitars creates a really effective dynamic contrast, which sets up a strong impact going into the next section. Section D is also 4 bars long, and this is where everything comes back in. All of the guitar layers return, and the full texture is back. The bass is being played live again throughout the section, but instead of just reinforcing what was happening before, the line shifts to accent that fast 7/16 guitar figure. So what was once a sparse part becomes busier, with less space and more motion. The drums also step things up here. The drummer brings in the hi-hat for the first time, which immediately adds more movement and energy compared to anything we've heard so far. And on top of that, the kick and snare patterns shift as well, locking in with that repeating 7/16 rhythm. This feels like the first real full band moment, where all the elements are working together to push up the energy. Section E is also 4 bars long, and this is really the first time we hear a true return. Essentially, this is a repeat of section C. The guitar layers are still looping in the background unchanged, the bass is played live again, following the same idea that we heard in section C. And the drums pull back as well, dropping the hi-hat out and returning to that more sparse feel. So after the fuller energy of the previous section, this feels like a reset. We're back to something more stripped down and open. Then at the very end of the section, on the final 7/16 phrase, everything drops out, both the live parts and the loops, and the only thing that carries us forward is a snare fill, which acts as a transition into the next section. In section F, they repeat section D. So what's really happening here is that both sections C and D have now been repeated as a larger unit. The guitar layers return to that fast 7/16 part that we heard in section D, looping underneath everything as before. The bassist is playing live again and following that same pattern, but this time there's a bit of a shift in how it's handled. They play the bass live for the first half of the section and then capture it into the looper for the second half. And while all this is happening, the guitarist uses the second half of the section to get set up for the next part. The drummer follows right along with the bass, bringing back the same hi-hat groove that we heard earlier in section D. And right at the end, he or she plays a subtle fill, just enough to signal that we're about to move into something new. Section G is another 4-bar section, but this one really starts to build tension. The bass continues that fast 7/16 pattern, holding everything down and keeping the momentum going. The drums follow that same general idea as before, but now there's a clear shift in intensity, especially in the second half, where the hi-hat gradually opens up, adding a bit more grit and urgency to the groove. The drummer's volume also crescendos as this is happening, really building towards something. They also add a light cymbal hit on the downbeat of bar 3 just to mark the beginning of the repeat. And then, at the end of the section, the drummer throws in a snare fill, which clearly sets up what feels like a major arrival point in the next section. On the guitar side, this is where things open up a bit. They actually mute the original loops from sections A and B, which creates space and lets the bass and drums come through more clearly for a moment. At the same time, the guitarist comes in live with that same fast 7/16 riff, but this time in a lower register, so it feels heavier and a bit more grounded. And right at the end, both players throw in this odd vocalization that almost acts like a fill, which adds to the build-up and pushes everything right to the edge before the main melody comes in. For section H, we return to the idea of an 8-bar section, and this is really where everything comes together. The guitar and bass continue looping the same parts from the previous section, but the drums make a pretty dramatic shift. They move into something that feels like a disco-inspired beat. Basically, it's a 2/4 groove with a kick on every beat, snare on the backbeat, and steady 2-handed 16ths on the hi-hat. So on its own, it's essentially a straightforward 4/4 disco pattern. But here's where it gets interesting. The rest of the band is still in 7. So now you've got the drums cycling in 2, while the guitar and bass are cycling in 7. And those two patterns don't line up cleanly. Since the 2-beat drum pattern does not divide evenly into the 7-beat guitar pattern, everything only really locks back together once every 14 beats. So there's this constant sense of push and pull, like the groove is slightly off balance, but still somehow holding together. In music theory, this is called polymeter, 2 different time feels happening at the same time, and it's surprisingly hard to track where one actually is. But here's the payoff. This is where the main melody finally comes in. It's a 2-bar phrase, and it immediately gives you something to latch onto, even though it's built on that same microtonal language we've been hearing the whole time. And this is probably the closest thing that the song has to a chorus. It's the moment where your head starts to bob a little bit more naturally, even though technically everything underneath is still kind of fighting itself rhythmically. The drums close up the section with a tom fill. Section I is basically a repeat of section G, but with a few key differences to give it more punch. The main melody drops out, creating space for the rhythm section to breathe and letting us focus on the groove. The bass and rhythm guitars continue the same patterns that we've been hearing from sections G and H, keeping that fast 7/16 momentum going. Meanwhile, the lead guitar plays that fast riff in the lower tenor register again, but now with an added effect. What sounds like a mix of ring modulator, pitch shifting, and some fuzz. The drums shift back to 7 as the chorus ends, which in itself creates a significant contrast, even though the guitar and bass parts remain the same. The open hi-hat groove from the end of section G returns, but this time it's more aggressive and the drummer throws in accents on the cymbals to push the energy even further. And just like in section G, the section closes with a snare fill and a vocalization from the musicians, helping to set up the transition and back into the chorus. Even though it's only 4 bars, the section really ramps up the intensity and prepares the ears for the return of the main melody. The next section, section J, is essentially an exact repeat of the chorus. All of our parts remain effectively unchanged from what we heard last time. The main takeaways here are the return of the guitar hook and the return of that 2/4 disco beat, along with the tension it creates as the rest of the band continues in 7. Section K is effectively a return to section I. The same high energy feel comes back, including that affected guitar tone with what sounds like ring modulation, pitch shifting, and fuzz. So everything ramps up again and then suddenly pulls back. At the end of the section, the band lands on a sustained note or chord. It's hard to even define exactly what it is, given the tuning, but it holds for 2 bars. And while it's ringing, the pitch slowly bends downward. Sounds to me like they're using a whammy pedal to achieve this, which gives it this warped, almost melting quality. The drums drop out completely here, aside from a decaying cymbal, and the result is a ton of space, kind of suspends the momentum and leaves everything hanging, creating this sense of tension and mystery around what's about to come next. The next section, section L, is 16 bars long, and it feels like a bit of a reset. The drums strip things down to a simple 4-on-the-floor kick pattern, something you'd normally associate with dance music. And underneath that, the bass introduces a completely new line. It's built around a lot of wide octave jumps, which gives it a surprisingly disco feel, even though it's still in 7. And because of those octave jumps, the microtonality becomes a little less noticeable here, since an octave is something that our ears are already very used to hearing. The bass line itself is 14 beats long, so essentially 2 bars of 7. The bass line gets looped and repeats over and over, 8 times in total, so it really locks you into the groove. Then right at the midpoint, on the downbeat of bar 9, they introduce this really strange vocalization, and from that point on, it shows up at the start of every repeat of the bass line. What makes it even more unusual is that both musicians pair it with this synchronized arm movement, which adds this almost ritualistic, slightly surreal visual element to the whole thing. And then right at the end of the section, everything hits together, a strong fuzzy chord with the drums right on the last beat. It acts like a pickup pulling you straight into the next section. Section M is 16 bars and builds directly on what we just heard in section L. The bass continues looping that same disco pattern, so the groove is already firmly established from the start. The guitar comes in and doubles that bass part, locking in with it rhythmically and reinforcing the feel. They play it through twice live, then capture it into the looper, which frees the guitarist to start setting up for the next layer. At the same time, the drums come in with a simple closed hi-hat groove, something that feels more like a straight 4/4 pattern again. So just like earlier, you get that tension between the drums and the rest of the band, since the underlying structure is still in 7. The drummer keeps it pretty restrained here, but adds the occasional small fill, pickup, and cymbal accent to keep things moving. Then, at the midpoint, the drummer doubles the rhythm of the hi-hat, going from quarter notes to eighth notes, increasing the energy. At the same time, the guitar part gets locked into the looper and a second guitar layer is added on top. This new layer is a parallel harmony to the original disco line, so now the texture thickens and the groove starts to feel bigger and more developed without actually changing the core idea. It's less about introducing something new and more about expanding what's already there. Section N is 32 bars and is essentially the climax of the song. The main melody returns, but now in a completely new context, surrounded by everything that's been built up over the last few sections. The bass and guitar continue looping that disco pattern, so the foundation stays the same, but everything on top of it starts to intensify. The drummer opens up the hi-hat, giving the groove a more aggressive, washy sound. Fills start getting bigger and more frequent, and by the end of bar 8, there's a large fill that pushes into bar 9, where the drummer shifts over to the ride cymbal. That change alone opens up the sound even more. From that point on, there's a clear pattern. Every 8 bars, the drummer hits a little harder and pushes a little more, so you get this long, gradual crescendo building across the entire section. At the same time, the guitarist is adding new layers with the looper each time through, so the texture keeps getting thicker, denser, and more chaotic. Nothing fundamentally changes, but everything becomes more layers, more volume, more intensity, until all of it reaches a breaking point, and then suddenly, everything drops out at once. And what's left is that weird vocalization, completely exposed, which makes the moment feel even more dramatic after everything that came before it. So after all of that, after breaking down every section, every layer, every rhythmic idea, we're kind of back where we started. On paper, this shouldn't work. Microtonal melodies that don't follow traditional pitch rules, odd time signatures, sometimes multiple at once, a live looping setup that's constantly shifting in real time. These are all things that usually make music less accessible, but somehow Angine de Poitrine are clicking with millions of people. And I think part of the reason is because it feels like the complete opposite of what we're used to hearing. Right now, AI is creeping into music, and a lot of it ends up sounding sterile and derivative because, well, it's derivative by nature. And this genuinely feels new, unpredictable, a little chaotic, not quite following the rules that we're used to. And it gives it a kind of raw human quality that's hard to fake. But here's the interesting part. Underneath all of that, they're actually relying on something incredibly familiar. They're constantly building around short, repeatable 2 and 4 bar phrases, repeated 2 times, 4 times, 8 times. This is something I call the rule of 4, and it shows up in just about every style of music. So even though the surface feels completely new, the structure is something that your brain already understands. And that's really the balance that they've nailed here. It allows them to push into new territory without losing the listener. And I think that's why this works.